Over the years, discourses and research on development and social justice tended to focus on broad ideals of development such as poverty, alleviation, and combating inequality, whereas society's lived experiences in relation to development interventions have not sufficiently been engaged with. This sometimes conceals competing and conflicting local contexts of development interventions and the underlying conditions for which they are accepted, rejected, or ignored.
Moreover, dominant discourses on global development and social justice arising from certain schools of thought are recognized as increasingly problematic when placed alongside questions such as who benefits from global development, who decides how social justice is reached for, and on what grounds, and related questions on the best path to reach social justice. With this in mind, the 15th Development Dialogue is an attempt to initiate a conversation on the vital issues of praxis. What unique contribution can PhD researchers make to research in order to challenge discourses and research practices in ways that can contribute to social justice? We hope that we can create an opportunity for everybody to contribute and dialogue in this next 3 days.
Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to our rector, Professor Dr. Inge Hutter, so she can officially open the 15th Development Dialogue.
Thank you very much. And well, it's congratulations with the lustrum of 15 years of development dialogues. Brenda just asked me, well, is this the first time actually that you're attending the development dialogues? And yes, that's true, although I'm here for 2 years. The past 2 years I missed it because of traveling. I couldn't be here, I tried to be here. So I enjoy it very much that I can make it now and can participate in part of the program. So the 15th meeting, and in a year that's very special for ISS, because we exist 65 years. So usually you think 65, that's retiring, but we are not yet, really not yet. We plan to have many more years. Someone said this week, well, another 65 years. Well, who knows, that would be wonderful. So this week we have several meetings organized, and on Monday, for example, we had someone from Nuffic presenting on the history, what are our roots as ISS, being established in 1952, and he nicely sketched the feeling in the Netherlands at that time of course, the sadness and frustrations about the Second World War just ended, also decolonization of Indonesia, but also a kind of a spirit, we're going to rebuild the Netherlands again. And sketching that kind of an atmosphere was actually quite nice to see. Well, from there, the ISS started. It was actually our queen, then Queen Juliana, who mentioned in the United Nations that there would be an International Institute of Social Studies being established. It also reflected kind of the way how people were thinking and how our institute was funded or founded and started. And I see our lustrum, our birthday tomorrow in the DS, as also a kind of looking where are we at now, 2017. And you can actually only understand that if you look back where you come from. What are your roots? How are you established? Where are we now and where do we want to go in the future? And we're working, all of us, on that, also on a strategic plan. That was a meeting what I found very important. We also have a lot of scientific meetings more. Yesterday we had the seminar organized. We have now the Development Dialogue seminar. And some of the topics here are quite interesting, I feel. For example, I did see the decolonizing of knowledge. I think, well, that immediately relates back to our roots. Where do we come from? Where do we stand now? And what does that mean actually for our future? Then several of our researchers, senior researchers, have been working also for our strategic plan for the future on different shades of development. Wendy has been coordinating that, but a couple of our researchers have been adding to that. And I'm very curious whether those different shades are coming back in this seminar or meeting as well. What I find also very interesting, localizing the global, the combination of the two, the global and the local. And the global development and social justice, what is also the theme of our research program. Some aspects I find interesting. One other additional point, what I find interesting myself, is that talking about theory, but also the practice. And what actually is then the practice? If we do academic research for our PhD, then what is the practice? I'm very curious what comes out there. So, well, just some thoughts to start this 2 days, 3 days, 4 days seminar, 3 days seminar. That's quite a lot of time to think, to discuss, to be in dialogue. I wish you a very good time, very pleasant time, lots of discussion, a lot of deeper thinking. And well, I declare the meeting open. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Hutter. And next, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rosalba Icaza from ISS, who will be our moderator for the keynote session. Rosalba Icaza is a senior lecturer at the Institute for Social Studies of the Erasmus University Rotterdam, where she also serves as chair of the ISS diversity team. She recently conducted research on the state of epistemic diversity in university curricula as a member of the University of Amsterdam Diversity Commission, which was chaired by Professor Gloria Wecker. Rosalba recently acted as guest editor of the latest issue of the Dutch Journal of Gender Studies with the theme Decolonizing the University, which diagnoses the gendered and colonial legacies underlying in the modern university through practical examples, novel methodologies, and interventions in curricula and the academy. She has been involved in collaborative research initiatives dealing in Mexico and Central and South America, exploring the global governance of knowledge and the practices of epistemic dissent and resistance. Rosalba is member of the transnational network Other Knowledges and the Transnational Decolonial Institute and Summer School in Middelburg. Rosalba teaches action research methodologies, post-development and decolonial feminism, and is committed to facilitating spaces for mutual learning between practitioners and academics. Rosalba holds a PhD and an MA in Politics and International Studies from the University of Warwick, and a Bachelor in International Relations from Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico City. She has been granted twice the prestigious European Commission Marie Curie Fellowship in 2005-2007 and in 2007-2009, and has received Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, Oxford University, and Warwick University research grants. Thank you, Rosalba.
Well, it looks like a lot, but thank you very much, Brenda, and thank you to the Development Dialogue Committee for inviting me to moderate this discussion that we're going to have today. It's really an honor to be here, and I was just mentioning to our keynote speakers that at least for me, this is the first time that I'm part of a conversation in which women from the Global South are sitting here to share with all of us their knowledges. So I'm very, very honored to be here. But now let me introduce our first speaker, Professor Breny Mendoza. She is chair of the Department of Gender and Women's Studies at California State University, Northridge. Her areas of specialization are decolonial feminism, Latin American studies, studies of mestizaje, feminist political theory, transnational feminisms, and social movements. Breny obtained her PhD at Cornell University in city and regional planning, and her master at the Free University of Berlin in political sciences. She also has a bachelor's in, from the Rupert Karl University of Heidelberg in Germany. Breny has also worked as a consultant in gender and social policy issues for diverse international development agencies such as the UNDP, UNICEF, the GTZ, and others in Honduras, Nicaragua, and Mexico. She has published 3 books: Ensayos de Crítica Feminista en Nuestra América, critical essays on feminism in our Americas. She has also co-edited a book with Deborah Castillo and Mary Jo Dudley entitled Rethinking Feminism in the Americas, published by Cornell University. And she also published Sintiéndose Mujer, Pensándose Feminista, feeling oneself a woman, thinking oneself a feminist. And a monograph, Repensando lo Político, Rethinking the Political, published by the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Perú. Breny has also published several articles in Latin American, US, and European journals and chapters in books. She is originally from Honduras, and I should also mention that Breny is one of the required readings of our general course. So we also are very happy to bring a face and a person to some of the readings that our students in ISS actually have to go through during their studies. Welcome, Breny.
Thank you. Thank you for that generous introduction. I am also very honored to be here in this development dialogues, 15th Development Dialogues, and also the 65th anniversary. So it really is a special moment. So I'm very happy to be here. I want to thank the organizing committee that I have been in contact in the last weeks, Brenda Rodriguez to start, Richard Topo, I don't know if you're here, and Rosalba Garza too, which we've been also in contact. So, well, thank you very much for taking the risk also of inviting somebody that actually has kind of left behind development. You read right now a little bit of my previous experiences in development, but I have not worked within development really for a long time. So I feel like a distant relative now of development. So having said that, accepting the invitation was a little bit of a challenge for me because, of course, I thought, well, I have to think about development now. So, and I didn't have really much time. So I did some kind of a really rapid process in trying to see, well, what's going on? And I started off, of course, with Arturo Escobar, that I assume many of you have read, right? And he took me then for a ride. And I came up then with this little piece that I will share with you today, which I have titled, Can the Subaltern Save Us? Of course, that is I'm alluding to Spivak's article, Can the Subaltern Speak? Okay, so I'm going to read I know that's kind of boring, but otherwise I get out of line. So, at this point in history, to say that modernity and development may have led the world into a dark alley of possible self-destruction is a redundancy. As I write these pages, the Caribbean, Houston, Texas, and the Florida Keys have been devastated by 3 mega hurricanes, and parts of Mexico City lie in shambles after a 7.1 earthquake. And actually, 1 or 2 earthquakes, hurricanes came after this, destroyed Puerto Rico. In addition, the President of the United States has threatened to destroy North Korea in the General Assembly of the UN. Great swaths of the planet are cracked open from mining and fracking in search for oil, and the oceans are literally blown up for offshore drilling. Wars in Africa and the Middle East are littering the landscape with corpses and producing tons of carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, hydrocarbons, and sulfur dioxide in addition to CO2. The water supply of war zones is contaminated with oil and depleted uranium. That's kind of the world we live in today. The development of the atomic bomb by the US government and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki made it clear in 1945 that terminating life on Earth through science, technology, and war was a real possibility. It is in this context that the Frankfurt School warned us of the excesses of the instrumental rationality of Western culture and the human domination of nature. It was World War II also that revealed that the natural course of natural history could be ended through human intervention. Today, almost 80 years later, we talk about the Anthropocene, a potentially new geological era in which man-made destructive forces make the Earth uninhabitable. Did you understand that? Uninhabitable to all forms of life. Nuclear testing, chemical weapons, deforestation, desertification, the burning of fossil and biofuel, the acidification of the oceans, the pollution caused by plastic, and even the mass consumption of chicken is not only altering the nature of nature, but it is causing the sixth mass extinctions of thousands of species that the world has experienced in the last 700 million years. The realization that life as we know it is coming to an end is forcing many around the world to question the philosophical and the material foundations of the societies and cultures that have brought onto humanity the possibility of its finality. Given that Western civilization, modernity, and development are considered responsible for the definitive destruction of life, it is Western civilization's main tenets that are brought to the dock. In conjunction, because as Arturo Escobar repeatedly says, there are no modern solutions to modern problems, the solutions to the problems of modernity are surely to be found among the non-moderns, or so to speak, the cultures of the indigenous peoples of the world that have left the smallest ecological footprint on Earth. In other words, we must turn away from development and modernity and turn to indigenous ways of making worlds, especially Amerindian, to imagine the futurity of humanity. While there is no doubt that some of the indigenous ways of worlding offer alternatives to development and modernity, the relationship between moderns, non-indigenous peoples, and indigenous peoples has been fraught with epistemic and ontological violence since 1492. So, what is different today that we can eschew the obstacles that prevented us from learning from indigenous peoples in the past that makes it possible today to project our futures with their knowledge and ways of life? That is my question. A partial answer to this question is that indigenous peoples today are effectively producing alternative knowledges and practices that are creating alternatives to modernity and development. Another possible answer is that indigenous knowledges and ways of making worlds are perhaps the last frontier of moderns. So in what follows, I would like to reflect upon the contention and the political implications of attempting to find ecological salvation among the indigenous peoples by looking at how the narratives of modern scholars writing about the crisis of modernity find salvation in them or not. So I'm going to do sort of a review of some of the most critical work on crisis of modernity. And I have titled this section, The Quest for Redemption. Modernity and its offspring development have undergone successive indictments in the last decades. After World War II and the Frankfurt School that still relied heavily on Marxism and psychoanalysis for its critique of modernity, and just before the downfall of socialism in the Soviet Union and its satellites towards the end of the 80s, elite scholars in the West manifested great skepticism regarding the main goals of the Enlightenment project, which had promised to end human suffering through science, technology, and secularism. Scientific positivism, the inevitability of human progress, and the access to truth in capital letters were seriously questioned by a group of scholars referred to as postmodernists. Postmodernists are said to have produced a linguistic turn in Western social theory by focusing on the role of text and language in the construction of reality. Postmodernists were perhaps the first ones in the West to postulate the artificiality of subjectivity, knowledge, and reality, and perhaps most importantly, its internal connections to power. Their questioning of reality and representation and their critiques of the meta-narratives of the West called not only for the decentering of Western stories of the world and its dynamics, but the liberation of the subjugated knowledges it had procured on the perceived non-moderns of the world. Postmodernism signaled a crisis of modernity by shaking its main pillars: binary thinking, the hierarchy between the modern and the non-modern, and the lineal conception of time. But as some decolonial theorists have pointed out, the postmodern critique of modernity was a critique of modernity from within, an inside job still incapable of fully grasping its underside, namely colonialism, implying with this that the West remained blind to its own conditions of possibility. From this perspective, the non-modern appeared then underneath the dialogues of postmodern scholars. The presence of the non-modern was rather more in his or her absence or silence, which had the perverse effect of tacitly reconstituting the centrality of the Western man. But perhaps something far more pernicious was occurring: the voluntary abdication of the centrality of the West that postmodernism offered to the rest of us enabled the Western man to find a seat next to his non-modern counterpart, since now his truth appeared as one among many others. This postured equalizing allowed the Western man to disentangle himself from Western colonial history, which was just a bad history book, relieving himself, and I'm using the masculine on purpose here, relieving himself from the responsibility of the destruction of other worlds. This explains why subjugated knowledges of the non-modern world never really made it into the postmodern canon. Nonetheless, their phantasmagorical appearance would serve to absolve the Western man from history's indictments. Postmodernism would imagine a palimpsest of cultures whereby Western culture would be forever innocent. There was still a future for the West, perhaps even a resurgence if it could only tolerate difference. The non-modern, even in his ghostly appearance, would become then the vital lifeline for the West. But by the end of the 90s, postmodernism began to lose its charm and subsisted mainly inside other iterations of it. For example, within postcolonial criticism and globalization theories that rebelled on themes of difference and culture, which were later translated into neoliberal and multicultural rhetoric and policy. Postcolonialism, as we know, emerged under the influence of postmodern perspectives, but was developed in the non-modern world. Interestingly, a central concern for postcolonial critics is the impossibility of the subaltern, which is like an equivalent to indigenous peoples, to be heard on his or her own terms, not only from within Western canons, but presumably within their own non-modern traditions. The postcolonial project was set up, therefore, to locate and reestablish the voice of the subaltern of the colony. Spivak warned postcolonial critics of their futile attempt to grant collective speech to the subaltern, as they would ironically also reinscribe and co-opt the voice of the subaltern in much the same way the Western colonizer had done. Cultural solidarity amidst a panoply of voices of a heterogeneous subaltern and speaking for the subaltern seemed a self-defeating strategy. But what was the importance of breaking the silence of the subaltern for postcolonial critics? What was the subaltern, the repository of an unspoken truth that had redemptive powers? But for whom? The savior rhetoric of the West that rescues the downtrodden non-modern from the other non-moderns seems to have been inverted here. The postcolonial critic appears as a stand-in or as an imposter of the postmodern critic, searching salvation in the silenced subaltern other. A short-lived version of this experiment was also done in Latin America with the Latin American Subaltern Studies Group that would also attempt to do the same, taking the literary genre of testimonio as their way of articulating the voice of the subaltern. As their predecessors, they too failed as ventriloquists and disbanded soon after. Interesting here is the backlash against the audacity of an indigenous woman, Rigoberta Menchú, to try to make her word present through a testimonial written by a modern scholar. A few years into the debate, David Stoll, a US-American anthropologist, would attract the veracity and authenticity of Rigoberta Menchú's testimonial in an apparent attempt to return her to silence and discredit her. the writer of the Testimonio, who was actually from Venezuela, married to Regis Debray, remained unscathed from the attack. At the end of the 90s, decolonial theories from Latin America started to take center stage, and they also came along with a project of restoring the voices of the indigenous peoples. As postmodern and postcolonial before them, decolonial thinking was concerned at first with Eurocentrism and epistemic decolonization as a crucial domain of struggle towards transmodernity or alternatives to modernity and development. The border thinking of the Chicana feminist writer Gloria Anzaldúa was singled out by Walter Mignolo as the proper way of grasping a reality that had been largely denied by the coloniality of power and the coloniality of knowledge. Border thinking was thinking from the exteriority and from the lived experience of the colonized. Thus, tapping into indigenous epistemological traditions seemed crucial to enact decolonization not only of the indigenous peoples, but also of non-indigenous people, which in Latin America includes white and mestizo Criollo folks like me. Interestingly, white and mestizo Criollo folks appear in this narrative not as internal colonizer, but as natural allies of indigenous people. In this manner, decolonial border thinkings would appear not only as co-authors, but also as rescuers of a lost knowledge. As Kyle Poe White, a Potawatomi scholar, has noted of white North American allies of indigenous peoples in their part of the colony, Canada and the United States, non-indigenous allies in the South can feel redeemed as they are now doing what their ancestors failed to do in the past. They are thinking with indigenous peoples and not against them. Border thinking is in this way the lifeline of white mestizo trio decolonials. It is arguably what allows the coexistence of two rather different worlds. It is no wonder that when leftist regimes of Ecuador and Bolivia introduced buen vivir, or life in plenitude, and the rights of nature in their constitutions, this gesture was hailed as a decolonial moment in which indigenous knowledges were finally encoded in the political, even though these conceptions were indexed in a modern colonial liberal political code. After all, they were in constitutions. Not to be left unmentioned are, of course, the attempts of indigenous intellectuals to salvage ancestral knowledges to counter the assaults of modernity and development. Indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples who have regrouped politically since the 90s, or even earlier, across the continent, see themselves as engaged in a civilizatory debate in which a new civilizational model should emerge that is based on non-capitalist, non-liberal, non-state, and non-colonial practices rooted in their ancestral knowledges. The preservation and the extension to non-indigenous folks of communal forms of living, the unveiling of ontological different way of relating to humans and the non-human, and the recognition of their autonomy vis-a-vis the state is at the center of the new proposal. The motto here is the Zapatista idea of creating a world in which many worlds fit. But as recent experiences show us, it is very difficult to reconcile indigenous proposals with existing political structures, even with those that claim to be refounded on plurinationality and interculturality. Interculturality, as the possibility of dialogue between cultures, reaches its limits first and foremost at the level of the state, which can bring into the fold of modernity and development indigenous cultural propositions that allegedly would have changed its internal logic and functioning. A case in point is the economy of extreme extractivism of so-called progressive regimes. The regimes of mestizo criollos and an Aymara indigenous president in Bolivia neither have protected the rights of nature nor changed the modern exploitative relationship to nature. Instead, they have continued the destruction of indigenous communities, encroaching on their territories and causing extreme damage to the environment with their energy extractivist mega projects. Another area of knowledge that has recently rediscovered ancestral knowledges, myths, and practices of Amerindians as profoundly questioning established assumptions of modernity and development is anthropology. From this perspective, Amerindian ontologies seem to hold the key to a whole new view of nature and culture that can save the world from modern monsters such as colonialism, capitalism, and climate change, and thus can help us build better futures. This has become known as the ontological turn, and even consider the salvation of anthropology, which had in the recent past been reduced to just being the reflection of the concerns and obsessions of modern anthropologists. The work of the Brazilian Eduardo Viveiros da Castro stands out in this renovation of anthropology. As some have noted, the ontological anthropology that Viveiros da Castro puts forward is fundamentally the story about the Amazonian Amerindian. In a journey of discovery through the seas of ethnography of the Amazons, Viveiros da Castro's eye and deep modern sense can access the alter concepts of nature and humanity of the isolated Amazonian Amerindian and offer them to the moderns to tackle their own problems. And what he sees is quite interesting. He finds another reality that does not differentiate human from non-humans. Not only is no distinction made between humans and non-humans, such as spirits and animals, neither is animality or some form or version of it what humans share with animals or non-humans, but it is humanity that they share with each other. In this reality, animals are former humans with an animal body, having lost the attributes of the human body, but not their humanity or personhood. What differs then is only their perspective of the world and of each other. He calls this the Amerindian perspectivism. The caveat here is not that they see no difference between the bodies of animals and humans, but that animals, a jaguar for instance, possesses his own perspective of the world and can only be understood from this perspective. Human animals perceive themselves as persons, just as humans see themselves as persons, but the jaguar, a predatory human animal for instance, sees human simply as prey, a delicious meal. Conversely, the human can perceive the jaguar as a predatory animal or a spirit. In this cosmology, there will be variations in perspective whether you are a human with a human body or a predatory human animal like the jaguar or a spirit. There will be multiple natures, but all of them are anthropomorphized in one culture. This multiplicity of natures not only collapses the distinction of nature and culture, but also the divide between the subject and object, as all agents are endowed with subjecthood and a perspective. This highly complex rendition of Amerindian ontology is considered an antidote to modern great divides between nature and culture. It enables the recognition of ontological non-human rights of nature that modernity denies. Idilberto Avelar, a Brazilian literary theorist, goes so far as to affirm that Amerindian anthropomorphism and perspectivism can be useful to slow down the Anthropocene and gives the example of the rights of nature recognized in the constitutions of Ecuador and Bolivia as proof of the contributions of Amerindian ontologies. So in a nutshell, what we find in this new anthropology is the extraction of alter concepts from the perceived radical alterity of the Amazons as a reminder for moderns that they too can create forms of thinking otherwise, if only they can emulate indigenous peoples. Here we encounter yet again non-modern concepts and alter worlds helping moderns cope with a world of destruction they have brought onto themselves. While no concern about the wreckage of the Amazonian world is foregrounded, it is to be assumed that it's precisely the wreckage that enables the forward thinking so needed by moderns. Another exponent of the ontological turn is the Argentinian anthropologist Mario Blazer, and there are others, Marisol de la Cadena and Arturo Escobar, who like Viveiros da Castro is engaged in uncovering other ways of being and of the real of indigenous peoples that can offer modern solutions to the problems caused by modernity and development. Blazer is also concerned with the assumption that modernity encompasses all that there is, as if non-modern reals are a thing of the past and do not deserve to be taken seriously. The point is that modernity was never able in the past or the present to eradicate alternative ontologies completely. These multiple ontologies still exist and come in conflict with Western ontological forms. Multiple ontologies taken seriously allow us then to imagine the possibility of worlds free of the challenges of the Anthropocene, but perhaps more specifically, the possibility of the pluriverse, or a world where many worlds fit. By recognizing the existence of multiple ontologies, then, the modern misconception of the existence of only one world and multiple cultures is thus challenged. So I reach now my conclusions. This cursory review of diverse theories that are concerned with the crisis of modernity and development reveals a double process. On the one hand, we observe moderns, post-colonial and decolonial included, trying to appear as saviors of the subaltern because they intuit a revelation so powerful it will prevent the definite destruction of the world, or at least redeem them from the sins of their ancestors. On the other hand, we find them giving a substantive importance to the concepts and ontologies developed by non-moderns to imagine futurity for themselves. Instead of rescuing the subaltern, it is the subaltern that rescues them. In both strategies, the moderns seek salvation from the subaltern, whether to absolve themselves from the history or to rescue the history of man or the history of the father. The question seems to be, can the subaltern save us? It is not my intention to reiterate the usual objections to these theoretical practices by calling them a romanticization or exoticization of indigenous cultures, or that they homogenize and make undue generalizations. I'm not saying either that indigenous epistemologies and ontologies should not be taken seriously. They should. The point I want to make is that these theoretical propositions of moderns are problematic because they involve what native feminist Eve Talk calls subtle moves to innocence. Subtle moves to innocence are the ways the descendants of the colonizers attempt to diminish the sense of guilt and complicity in the destruction of indigenous worlds and to secure a settler futurity. Potawatomi scholar Carl White reminds us of something else which is very important. The current dread of apocalyptic futures due to the climate change are not new to indigenous peoples. Colonialism was and still is experienced as an apocalypse involving the extinction of their social, natural, cultural habitats and the core of their spirit. Thus, many of their ways of coping with catastrophe must be traced to their attempts to survive colonialism and not merely or necessarily to a radical difference worthy of emulation by moderns worried about their collective future. One could surmise that the desire to emulate indigenous ontologies also contains the imperial fantasy to appear as the savior of cultures that otherwise would extinguish. For Latin American white mestizo criollo scholars who do not see themselves as settlers, but as natural allies of indigenous peoples, it is high time to reflect upon our own responsibility for the destruction of indigenous worlds. Fantasizing about a future based on a radical difference of indigenous peoples can be, in fact, just another form of extractivism, one that we should not justify as necessary for our survival. Thank you. In the process, I was sometimes disagreeing with myself already or seeing some contradictions, so I'm happy to hear your comments.
Thank you. Well, oops, yeah. Your water, yes, we will have time to address, of course, some of the issues of your provocative keynote. But let me now give the opportunity to Pragma to say something to us. But before that, let me just